Pirkei, Mishnah Yud Beis, chapter 5, 12th Mishnah. We're going to learn about 4 kinds of students. It's funny, right? You're learning about students. So, Pirkei, Mishnah Yud Beis. I don't know, the Mishnah divisions are different in different... It's very interesting because we're also going to see, I'm curious to see what the wording in this Mishnah, because there's 2 girsas. There's 2 versions of this Mishnah. Well, it's just one word difference, but it is interesting. I'll be curious to see which version you have. So this is Arba Midois Betalmidim. There are 4 characteristics of students. What number Mishnah is it there? Are you still finding it? Arba Midois Betalmidim. There are 4 characteristics, or 4 divisions, or 4 classes of students. Now I'm going to ask a question before we start. If we're talking about 4 different kinds of students, who is the Mishnah addressing? The teacher, right? Or the students. Could be either. So we're going to have to work this out. Is this Mishnah directed at the teacher, or is this Mishnah directed at the students? Okay, so that's what we're going to have to keep in mind. What is it? Tes Vav. Wow, look at that. Such a vast difference in the layout of different Mishnahs. That's really interesting. Okay, so it's either the 12th or the 15th Mishnah, depending, which particular division you use. Okay, so what are the 4 kinds of students? Please do not nod your head or give any non-verbal indications of which one you feel you are. Okay? Okay, so the first one is Maher lishmoya umaher le'abed. Now, if you translate it really, really literally, quick to hear and quick to lose. But really what it means is quick to learn and quick to forget. Quick to grasp and quick to forget. Okay? So I'm saying don't give it away. Don't give it away. Okay? Quick to grasp and quick to forget. Yatsa schoroi behefseidoi. The gain of the quick understanding is lost in the quick forgetting. Which makes sense, right? Whatever the person benefited because they understood so quickly is unfortunately lost by the fact that they don't retain it. Next category of student is the exact opposite. Koshe lishmoya vekoshe la'abed. It's difficult for them to hear, so it's difficult for them to understand, which means that it's slow to learn. But koshe la'abed, it's difficult for them to forget. So that is yatsa hefseidoi bischoroi. In that case, the loss of the fact that it takes so long to actually learn anything is mitigated by the fact that once they've got it, and they don't lose it. Some people are like that. Their mind, that just whatever goes in never leaves. But sometimes it takes time to get in. Okay, so those are the 2, shall we say, the most common versions. The person who's quick to learn and quick to forget versus the person who struggles to learn but really, really doesn't forget. Here's where you're going to get the 2 variations, is in the next piece. There's 2 variations about how you define the next person. The next person is who we want to be. We wish we were like this. Maher lishmoya, quick to learn, vekoshe la'abed, and difficult to forget. Okay, so what does it say? I'm just curious, in that version, what does it say? Harezeh? What is it? This person is called a Chelek Tov, right? Okay, good. So I was just curious about that, because there is another girsa which doesn't seem to be the girsa we follow in any of the Mishnahs that I've seen, that says Harezeh Chacham, that there's a wise person. But actually the more prevalent version of the Mishnah is Harezeh Chelek Tov. This person is somebody who has a good portion. Okay, so if you can grasp quickly and it takes time to forget, then you're a fortunate person. Now, if you remember in the previous Mishnah, we spoke about the people on the 2 extremes as being the person who is a chassid and the person who is a rasha, the person who's a very pious and elevated individual and the person who's, kind of off the rails. Here we're not speaking to character. Rabbeinu Yonah comments on this Mishnah, something which is, I think, is a beautiful way, at least in English, it comes out really nice to remember, and that is, the mind is a gift, character is a choice. Last Mishnah was talking about character. So we could make a decision, we can make a judgment. We could say, this person is a chassid, this person is a rasha, because character is a choice. But now we're talking about the mind. The mind is a gift, so there's no reason to attribute a certain character to the person. We're just saying, chelek toiv, the person has a good portion. They're very fortunate that they were gifted with that kind of mind that is quick on the draw and retains the information. And then the last one is, what's the last one? Kosher lishmoya. They battle to learn and understand in the first place, umaher le'abed, and then eventually when they do understand it, they can't retain it and they quickly forget it. Harizeh chelek ra. That is a bad portion for a person to have. Okay, so those are our 4 categories. And now as we start to unpack them, we're going to understand that not only are these categories about people as individuals, they may well be characteristic, at least some of them, of entire generations. That's where it's going to get really interesting. So let's bear in mind that over here we're talking both to the student and to the teacher. So there's a consciousness that the teacher has to have, there's a consciousness that the student has to have. Because in all likelihood, in a group of people, you'll have a whole mix. There are various kinds of people. Some are more and some are less academically capable than others. And they're all in the same environment, so both the teacher and the student has to know how to relate to that. So let's start with the first one. Maher lishmoya or maher la'abed. Quick to learn and quick to forget. So let's try and understand why that is. First of all, let's look for a moment just at the words, because they're interesting words. It doesn't say maher lil moid, which would mean to learn, nor does it say lishkoyach, which would be to forget. Instead, it uses the expressions lishmoya, which is to listen, and le'abed, which is to lose. You know, the Gemara says that one of the definitions of a fool, which has halachic repercussions, because a person who is a fool, what's called a shoiter, cannot perform certain halachic requirements. So one of the indications of somebody who is a shoiter, who is a fool, is that me'abed kol ma shenosnim loy. They lose whatever you give them. So you and I would think, oh, okay, that's somebody who's irresponsible. So you don't want to give them, obviously, you don't want to give them responsibility because they're irresponsible. Whatever you give them, they lose. But perhaps in the light of this Mishnah, we're not talking about losing items. It's not the person who's always looking for their keys, but rather the abed. This is the person who quickly loses the gift of information and wisdom that they were given. That's what we call a fool. Somebody's giving you the gift of information, is giving you the gift of wisdom, and you let it go. That's foolish. So let's understand the nature of this. Quick to internalize, or maybe that's not the right word, but quick to hear and quick to forget. So why do you think it says hear rather than learn? I mean, there might be layers to this, but let's at least try and understand one perspective first.
Often we don't hear properly.
Often we don't hear properly. Now that's interesting you say that, because the word lishmoya comes from the root shema, which is dafka supposed to be where you hear properly. So this is maher lishmoya, because there are other words, lahakshiv, lahazin, but lishmoya is supposed to indicate dafka, that a person hears something in a very meaningful way, that they actually pay attention. They choose to listen, right? So what is maher lishmoya? What could be wrong with that? What's maher lishmoya that causes maher la'abed? In other words, there's a link. There's a link between the two. In fact, the Maharal says it this way. When it comes to the laws of kashrus, so we have a principle in the laws of kashrus which is called keboy la'oi kach poltoi. Know what that means? Keboy la'oi, in the same way as the non-kosher item was absorbed as a taste. Because remember, all of kashrus is about taste, right? Because it's food. Food is eaten for taste. Therefore, what determines the halachic status of a non-kosher item that's been mixed into a kosher item is whether or not it tastes. Okay, so we can't really do the taste test. It's not a halacha shir over here, but you're not going to taste and say, ooh, actually taste treif, I shouldn't have had that. So we create formulae, and there's the 1 in 60 formula, bottle b'shishim, etc., in order to cover this issue. But the problem with, okay, maybe I'm being a little abstract, let's be practical. So somebody cooks, these are kitchen nightmares, right? Could do a whole series of this called Common Kosher Kitchen Nightmares. So what happens? A person has a pot. The pot is a meat pot. And accidentally, what do? They cook something that is a milchik dish inside the pot. Or, horrifically worse, somehow they cook the meat and then discover the meat wasn't kosher for whatever reason. Like in the old days when it used to happen. Now, you buy it from Moishes or whatever, it's a different story. But in the old days, you hear these stories where somebody was cooking the meat, the next thing, the shochet comes barreling in through the door and says, "Don't cook the meat! It came from the wrong animal. We found that it was not kosher." So the person got a pot, they cooked non-kosher meat inside. Now what? What's the halacha? Before we ask the halacha, what's the problem? Obviously you're going to throw out the food because the food wasn't kosher. What's the problem with the pot? How did the pot magically now become non-kosher? What happened? It absorbed what? The flavor. Okay? Because remember, the whole purpose of eating is for flavor. That's why we eat. I know everybody says we eat to live and nutrition and ahin aher, but if that was the case, we wouldn't be so concerned with, does it taste like this? Does it need more flavor, etc. So we eat for flavor. The flavor is what got absorbed into the pot. In order to kasher the pot, we've got to get it out. So kerboy lo'oi, whatever method caused it to be absorbed into the pot in the first place, kach poltoi, that's the kind of method we're going to have to use to release it, to make this pot kosher again. So how did it get in? What was the method? It was what kind of heat? A moist heat, right? There was boiling. Something was boiling in the pot. So how do you get it out? You use a moist heat. You boil up the pot and you drop in stones or whatever you got to do and let it overflow. All the various things that are around the same methodology. But if, for argument's sake, you had a grid of a braai and, God forbid, something treif landed up on the grid of the braai, it doesn't help to boil it. Because the cooking method, the method of absorption had nothing to do with moisture. So therefore the kashering method needs to be a more intense kashering method that is a dry heat. So you're going to have to burn it with the blowtorch or put it on the braai until it's hot enough that sparks fly or whatever you've got to do. So the principle is kerboiloi kach poltoi. Whatever it takes for something to absorb, that's what it takes for it to release, says the Maharal. That's the problem with a person who is quick. Maher lishmoya, if it was easy to get the information in, well, as the cliche goes, easy go. So maher lishmoya is not necessarily such an amazing gift, because once the information flies in with ease, it is possible to fly out with just as much ease. The advantage that the person had because it was easy for them to learn in the first place, that advantage is lost by hefsedoi. In fact, it's the cause of hefsedoi. It's the reason that there's a loss. Now this is fascinating because remember, we're speaking both to the teacher and we're speaking to the student. So let's work out what's the message here to the teacher and what's the message to the student. Before we do that, let's just remind ourselves that this is Pirkei Avos. And the whole objective of Pirkei Avos is to teach us how to deal with things beyond the norm. Right? This is mili de chasidusa. This is what you do beyond what is required. So before we talk about the teacher, let's just step back a second. What is the job of a teacher? Now, I know this is a controversial subject. It's going to depend on whether you still have kids at school. It's going to depend on what your children's experience of school is. And of course, it's going to depend on whether you're a teacher. So this could turn into a highly controversial issue. But let's try to keep it as peaceful as possible. So what is the responsibility of a teacher? To share, impart information, to educate children. Yes? That's the responsibility of a teacher. So in other words, Shuras Hadin, according to the strict requirements of a teacher fulfilling their contractual obligations, their job is get up in front of the class and teach. And if you really want to take it to the extreme, in the secular world, it's get up in front of the class and complete the syllabus, which may not necessarily include teaching. As long as we finish the set work, right? We had a teacher when we were in matric. I don't know if I should say this publicly, but anyway, we had a teacher in matric, Afrikaans teacher. Now, for those people who did not have the privilege of having to learn Afrikaans at school will never understand what this is, the pain. And we had this set work that we had to do for matric. And the worst part of it all was that the very last class of the entire week was a double Afrikaans class. I mean, it doesn't get worse than that. I mean, you're completely exhausted and finished and you've got to do this. So we collaborated as a class to convince our teacher that the best way for us to really learn the information that was in that set work was that each week, in that last double period, we should split up into pairs and prepare a dramatized version of one chapter of the book. And she thought this was a brilliant idea to be able to get us to really know the information. You know, we'd dramatize and get up and act out that particular chapter. Split up between the whole class. Everybody would do a section of the chapter. And the only thing is we told her that it's very distracting to do this with everybody else in the same room because, like everybody's doing the whole drama and everything. So we needed to split up around the campus to prepare this particular thing. And needless to say, in the last 15 minutes of the double period each week, when we had to come and present our dramatized version, we were like reading out of the set work, trying to work out what on earth, like who's supposed to go when, because nobody had done a thing, obviously. But the teacher had finished the set work. So that's what counted, right? So what is the responsibility of a teacher? Contractually, Shura Sadin, according to the letter of the law, is to teach. It is not the responsibility of the teacher to work out what kind of student each kind of student is. That's not a contractual obligation. But you want to be a good teacher. You don't want to be the kind of teacher who just says, I fulfilled my responsibilities. You want to be a good teacher that has a meaningful impact on the individual sitting in the class. In order to be a good teacher, you have to work out what kind of student is each student. That's a really good teacher. So the first question you've got to ask is, those students who are the A students, that make every teacher feel good and look good, those might be your problem students. Maher lishmoya. Those are the kids who get it like this. They just, as you say the information, so they know the information, they just spew it out on the next test, because if it's in a period of time that is close enough to when you taught the information, they've got the information and they got it quickly and you feel like you're a brilliant teacher. So the Pirkei Avos tells us, well, guess what? Check if they're not also Maher la'abeid. You don't know that you've really done your job as a teacher just because they got it. You need to know that they retain it. That's the responsibility. Okay, yes, it's beyond the requirement of the law, but you've got to know that such a thing exists. Don't get overly excited with the Maher Lishmoya part of your class, because it might just be in the short term, and education should never be for the short term. So that's your first responsibility. Maher Lishmoya, Maher La'abeid. Check that this person doesn't forget very quickly what they've learned. There's also a message to the student. Because you know what happens to the A students? The A students sit over there, look at us. We're so amazing. Oh, you have to repeat this again for them. But we all understand it. Like, this is boring. We all understand what's been said. Well, there's a message here to the student. Maher lishmoya, don't get onto your pedestal just because you got the information quickly. Now you've got to make sure that you do the single most important thing about education, which is the single most difficult thing for the smart kids. Review. Because there's the illusion of Maher Lishmoya, because you picked it up quickly, that you'll therefore remember it forever. To the contrary, Maher Lishmoya is a recipe for Maher La'abeid in most cases. So the Maharal says, easy come, easy go. The responsibility of the student is that you've got to, if you learn something easily and quickly, your responsibility is to make sure you review and review and review, because it's unlikely that easy learning is long-term learning. In other words, what the Maharal tells us is a fascinating concept. It goes into there's a number of, I think it's the Pirkei Avos says a very similar thing, but he makes it like a whole complicated insight into the fact of like, what kind of a brain do you have? Do you have a brain that is a heated brain or a cool brain? Do you have a brain that is Is it a dry brain or is it a moist brain? I mean, it's a whole fascinating analysis of the brain. But if you boil it down to its basic components, effectively what he says is this, that if a person is a malleable person, it's similar to what the Maharal said in the previous chapter, right? The person who gets angry quickly, that's a very flexible personality, so they can also settle down quickly. The person who takes long to get angry is a more rigid personality, so therefore when they're angry, they don't let go so easily. The same principle applies over here. You get, that was personality, this is brain. You get a more malleable brain, you get a more rigid brain. So the malleable brain is easy to take on information, because it's like a soft, absorbent brain. Yet at the same time, because it's a soft, malleable brain, it doesn't know how to hold on to information. Because when the new information comes, oh, let's take that, we'll get rid of this. You know, that's the kind of person, everything that they hear, they say, wow, have you heard that? That's amazing. And so every 6 months, they're changing their entire philosophy on life because they heard something else, they read another book, they attended a workshop or whatever the case is, and they were absolutely gung-ho about a particular version of life, but hey, I've read something else now, so we're going to do something different. So Mahir Lishmoya, they just bring in new stuff, and Mahir Abed, out goes the old stuff.
No, but it's just a generalization, because there are people that are brilliant, that are very clever, and retain information unbelievably.
Correct, and we're going to get to them. We're still going to get to them. So this is the...
They learned years ago.
Correct, but let's agree that they are an unusual breed. They're not common. This is far more common, right?
Who was the person who spoke about this malleable brain? What did you say it was?
So you'll see it in the Maharal and you'll see it in the Pirkei Avos. So, but I think it's the Pirkei Avos who uses more of that language. If you know the hot brain and the cool brain and the moist brain and the dry brain, it's really interesting. It's a very interesting language. So, yeah, we'll talk about that outlier category of people who both get it quickly and retain it. But the likelihood is that people who take things in quickly are also people who discard things quickly. It's a funny thing about life, and that's why there's the word lishmoya over here. Because what lishmoya means is they're quick to hear another thing. They're quick to hear. There's a big difference between hearing something and actually understanding something. And it's a big challenge, I think, as I mentioned before, we could talk about this generationally. I think it's a big challenge of our generation. Because in previous generations, they didn't hear so much diverse insight. They didn't have 1,000,001 podcasts to listen to. You know, what do you think? Just go back. And I'm not talking about 300 years ago. Just go back 20 years ago.
10 years.
Okay? What did you listen to in the car 20 years ago? The radio, right? Or tapes. You know, so I remember, like for years, sitting back and forth in the afternoons, used to go Mincha Ma'ariv with my father, and all for years was just Rabbi Victor Miller. Like there was no other voice in the car, you know, for years. So in today's world, you click here, you've got this opinion, you watch that video, this person's put out a podcast, that one sent you, you've got to watch this because there's so much lishmoya, there's so much to hear, that there's so much la'abed, there's so much to lose, because it becomes completely overwhelming. So mahir lishmoya could mean that we're a little bit scatterbrained. Yeah, mahir lishmoya, let me hear that. Oh, let me hear that. I don't necessarily have a true north. I just want to hear this and I want to hear that. And I'm talking within Judaism. We're not talking about somebody now who's shopping around in the great mall of philosophies. I'm talking about within Yiddishkeit itself. Let me hear this. I need to hear that. I need this thing and that thing and the next big thing. So mahir la'abed, we completely overwhelm our brains, and then mahir la'abed, we forget everything. In fact, and now I think it's the Yochin, but I could be wrong, says mahir lishmoya, he says a fascinating thing. Mahir lishmoya means we want to hear the speaker. Mahir la'abed, and we're quick to forget because we didn't realize that we're supposed to be listening to the wisdom. We become enamored with the presenter. You've got to hear so-and-so. This person is brilliant. And then we become like a groupie, you know? So it's almost like the opposite of the person who's scatterbrained and all over the place and just mahir lishmoya, taking in everything. But there's also the possibility of becoming totally fixated on the person I love their style. I love the way they talk. It's so interesting. It's so inspiring, that I don't actually realize that the wisdom is what I'm supposed to be focused on. So Mahir Lishmoya, I'm running to the next time they're going to speak, or the next time they're going to put out whatever it is, a recording or a video or a podcast or whatever. I got to hear it. Mahir Lishmoya, I got to hear the best because this is my favorite speaker. And Mahir La'abed, because we don't focus on the content. What's the value of the content? Yes, of course, there's somebody who presents the content in a way that speaks to me. Great. But I've got to cut the content. How do I consolidate the content? And so the message over here to the person who is Mahir Lishmoya, Mahir La'abed, which might very well be the so-called Google generation, Mahir Lishmoya, I can quickly get information. Sorry, Google is so last season. The AI generation. The ChatGPT generation. Mahir Lishmoya, I can get information so easily. And Mahir La'abed, as I once heard somebody say, I don't remember who it was, quite a number of years ago, says our generation knows less and less about more and more.
Yes.
That's our generation. Mahir Lishmoya, Mahir La'abed. On the other hand, you have a completely different generation, or a completely different kind of person. Kosher Lishmoya. Takes me a long time either to understand or until I can actually hear. I'm not going to just accept everybody who throws things at me. You've got to prove yourself, you've got to show your credentials. It doesn't just work that because somebody said something, I'm automatically just going to absorb it. Lishmoya, I'm going to take it in. No, I'm not necessarily going to take it in. Who are you? What's your track record? Does this align with things that I already know? I do have a true north. And I know what kind of things I'm willing to learn, or what kind of things resonate with what I know to be key principles. I'm not just going to, because everything that somebody uses that happens to have the language which sounds kind of as if it's Jewish language, so automatically it's okay, which unfortunately happens quite a lot in today's world. People just throw things out with a couple of Torah-related terms and we all say, wow, that's amazing. You see? Torah was speaking about mindfulness even before it was popular, or whatever particular thing we happen to put in, Hang on a second, kosher lishmoya. So it could be a very unhealthy thing. Kosher lishmoya, person who actually has a block that their mind doesn't absorb easily and quickly. Or it could be a decision. Kosher lishmoya. I'm not just going to listen. I'm going to test. Have you ever learnt Gemara? That's like a kosher lishmoya kind of a place. You don't get like Rava, who I think was a great person by all accounts, doesn't get up and say something and everybody says, yes, you're the man. We love you. When's your next shir? How can we subscribe to your podcast? No, Rava says something and Abaya says, how do we know it's true? Let's test this. The single most common conversation in the entire Gemara, you pretty much don't go 2 pages in a Gemara without an Abaya Rava confrontation. And what are they doing? They're not fighting with each other. They're making it kosher lishmoya. They're making it challenging so that you will actually hear. So when you hear kosher la'abed, you won't lose this because you've tested it, you've debated it, you've explored it, you've questioned it. You haven't just simply accepted it.
And this is why with Pesach, the asking of questions. Asking of questions. Yes. And
we're not afraid of asking questions as Jewish people. Right? We're not afraid of asking questions.
And the days where you could look things up in an encyclopedia, in fact, that is where you actually can retain even better.
Okay, I have an issue with that. So you'll excuse me saying I have an issue with the days of encyclopedias, because the fact is that an encyclopedia couldn't give you a 3-dimensional picture about something. I don't mean physical picture. Whoever decided they're editing the encyclopedia in this particular way, that was the information you got. It didn't have the robust experience of sitting with a chavrusa and arguing through a piece of learning. So it might have required more cognitive input than Googling or ChatGPTing something, but it was still one-dimensional. Torah learning is really different to that. Torah learning is dynamic. You don't just read the text and say that's what the text says. You read the text, then there are commentaries on the text, Then you have somebody you're learning the text with who challenges your understanding of whether you understood the text. And then you go to a shir where somebody turns everything that you've understood on its head. That's very different to just consulting the encyclopedia. So I think we have to be quite confident and quite proud of what we have in terms of Jewish learning, because it is so robust and so unique in that way. So kosher lishmoya and kosher la'abed could be a really negative thing. So yatsa hefseidoi bischoroi, there is a loss. There's a loss because it takes so long to learn. So that sounds like a negative thing. But wow, the value afterwards, because it's so consolidated. So I hope this is not a completely inappropriate reference, and if you feel offended by this reference, you could take it up with the management afterwards. But there used to be something called, well, there probably still is something called the Mad Magazine. You familiar with this? Yeah? So Mad Magazine always had a segment that was called Snappy Answers to Stupid Questions. Remember this? Snappy Answers to Stupid Questions. And I remember in those days, so I remember thinking, you can only have a snappy answer to a stupid question. A meaningful question can never get a snappy answer. Maher lishmoya, which is so much the attitude of today's generation. Maher lishmoya, nu, what's the answer? The whole value of kosher lishmoya, that if you really want to understand something in a meaningful way, it will be difficult. It will be challenging. It's going to require not only effort, but a little bit of discomfort and possibly even turning things that you thought that you knew on its head. Our generation that is maher lishmoya, everything's got to be just given to me in a download, is maher la'abed, is a generation not that forgets, but la'abed. We lose the wisdom. We lose the insight. We lose the value. We lose the cognitive development. We lose a whole lot. You don't just forget the information. We lose a whole spectrum of experience. Kosher lishmoya, if it is difficult, the process of coming to learn is a difficult process. The value is kosher la'abed. Not only do you not forget, but it's difficult to lose your way. It's difficult to lose your values, your wisdom, your insight.
I suppose with the difficulty of learning comes more thoroughness.
Yes, exactly.
If you have more thoroughness, you're able to more integrate what you're learning and put it into practice.
Exactly.
And once you put it into practice, then you hold on to the information much more than you would otherwise.
Correct.
So that kind of progression can make it much more like
Consolidated. Consolidated. Exactly. And that's what the Maharal says. Unless what?
Unless you don't learn it all.
Well, correct. Exactly. If you don't learn at all, well then, then you're giving up at the kosher stage. Oh, it was difficult, I'm not going to do it. But that's really what the Maharal is saying. K'boy la'oi, kach poltoi. If it was a lengthy, complex, difficult process to absorb, then it will require a lengthy, complex process to remove it. So exactly that. The challenge of difficulty consolidates learning in a unique way. So I just want to round off that topic by saying this. The teacher needs to know that the student who finds it difficult to learn, that's the student who's going to give the most nachas. Because when you invest in that student who kosher lishmoya, who their process of, it's not saying that they don't want to learn. It doesn't say that they refuse to learn. But kosher, it's difficult for them to learn. Those are the students that are going to turn into the kosher la'abed. The teacher will have to work harder. Because the maher lishmoya students, fantastic, we did this once, let's move on to the next page. But the kosher lishmoya student is going to require a lot of patience and insight and creativity from the teacher to find a way to help them through a lot of repetition and investment till eventually they get it. But when those students get it, they will get it in a way that the other students never get it. Because they will have been forced to find a depth of understanding and a depth of connection to the subject matter that is transformative. It's not just educational. And of course, then the message to the student is, don't be despondent because kosher lishmoya, because you're not chapping as quickly as the other kids in the class or the other people in your environment. Don't let that wear you down, because Rabbi Akiva was a great example of kosher lishmoya. It didn't come easily to him, and he had to get the whole message of the water dripping on the rock to convince him that if he kept banging his head against the sefer, eventually something would go in. And look what happened to Rabbi Akiva. So this is a really profound lesson, not only for the teacher to student, but for each of us in those areas where we don't necessarily find it so simple. Some parts of what we learn just talk to us. Other parts are challenging for us. Where's our real growth going to occur? In the areas that are challenging. Sorry, long...
I just want to say, isn't this the good fortune to be like that? Because you come to the right path. Because someone who could be quick to learn and hard to lose could learn the wrong things quickly and never lose that.
Good point. Good points. Good point. Good point. So let's get that's a very, very intriguing point. It's a really intriguing point. So the question is, maybe this is better than the person who's quick to learn and doesn't forget, because what if you learn the wrong stuff and now you can't get it out of your head? That's a really good point. So we'll come to that in a sec. I just want to share one very interesting anecdote. In the early history of Chabad, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the first Rebbe of Chabad, the Alter Rebbe, set up a yeshiva system where there were 4 groups, Aleph, Beis, Gimel, and Dalet. In each of those 4 groups, there were 4 groups, Aleph, Beis, Gimel, and Dalet. So the most brilliant students were called the Aleph Sheba Aleph students. And the students who battled the most were called the Dalet Sheba Dalet students. And the Alter Rebbe would always say, typically we get more nachas from the Dalet Sheba Dalet students than we ever get from the Aleph Sheba Aleph students. And that's really valuable as an educator and as a parent, or as the person who has a more challenging time, to remember that very often it's the Dalet Sheba Dalet student who actually comes out being the most amazing of all.
Except it's difficult for the child who gets put into that Dalet group.
Yeah.
You know, and
These weren't children, these were adults, but yeah, fair enough. Fair enough.
Whatever, you know, like initially.
Fair enough.
I mean, the antidote is that the Dalet Sheba Dalet, you know, gives more nachas. That is the antidote.
100%. So the message to the person who's put in that group, and I don't think in today's world, we're in a very different society to what it was 200 years ago. In today's society, you can't divide kids in any hierarchical way. You have to come up with more creative ways. If you have to stream, students have to come up with much more creative ways of labeling those streams so that you're not highlighting, weakness versus strength. It doesn't work in our generation. But at the same time, we have to be aware of the fact that those who go through the process slower are often the people who consolidate better. That's what we have to remember. So now if that's the case, Taka, how come Maher Lishmoya and Kosher La'abed is considered Chelek Toiv, a great portion? Who knows? Maybe it's not a great portion, right? Think about it. We all have experiences of things that we wish we could unlearn. So maybe it's not such a big deal. Maher Lishmoya Kosher La'abed. So again, the Maharal tells us, K'boy lo'oy, kach poltoy. The process is always that the way that a person absorbs will determine how well they can retain. So easy in, easy out. Difficult in, difficult out. So therefore the Maharal says if somebody has this experience of Maher Lishmoya and Kosher La'abed, that means they've been given a gift. The gift to be able to behave in a way that is unnatural. It's unnatural that it should be easy to absorb and still long-term retention. And so, basically, the Maharal is saying that's not going to happen to a person who lands up, so to speak, learning the wrong things. A person who learns the wrong things and can't change is actually the kosher, lishmoya kosher la'abed kind of person in a negative way. Because kosher over there means it was difficult what they got in, and now it's difficult to get rid of it. Maher lishmoya, not lilmoid. It's not saying that you're quick to learn. You're quick to hear what is correct in the learning. And kosher la'abed, and you don't lose it, that's a bracha. And therefore there's a message over here to the teacher. The teacher's going to have such a brilliant, every teacher wishes for this kind of genius in their class. What a pleasure. You teach them everything once, and they have this incredible memory, they never forget. It's an absolute pleasure. Says the Mishnah, teacher, this has nothing to do with you. Don't get all excited about that student because it might look good on your statistics, your grades on your class. It's a chelek toiv. This person was given a gift. That gift has nothing to do with you. Your teaching hasn't started with that student. That student's going to learn regardless of whether you're the teacher or nobody's the teacher. So it is no reflection on who you are as a teacher. And it's a message to the student. Message to the student is, don't get all excited about yourself. The fact that you are gifted is because you're gifted. Not because you're special, not because you did something to deserve the gift, because Hashem in His infinite wisdom decided that He was going to allocate this particular gift to you. This is not a reason to feel arrogant. This is a reason to feel mighty responsible. If Hashem's given me such a great gift, what am I doing with it? Am I using it well enough? It's quite similar to Moshe Rabbeinu, right? We're told that Moshe was the most humble person ever. Right? Where do we get told that? This week's parasha. So, the most humble person ever. So what, did Moshe walk around the whole day saying, like we do, people say to us, wow, you're really amazing. I'm not so amazing. Not so amazing. Yeah. Is that what Moshe did? And Moshe, you brought down the Torah. That's not such a big deal. So what did Moshe know? He said, this is all a gift. Maybe somebody else with the same gift would do a better job using it. That's where humility comes from. Maybe somebody else who was given this opportunity would be miles ahead of where I am. It's not an arrogant position. It's a very humbling and highly responsible position. And then the last person in the group is Koshe lishmoya and Koshe la'abed. Koshe lishmoya doesn't necessarily mean that they don't understand, that they have intellectual challenges. You know what sometimes is the most frustrating thing? Is somebody who is intellectual and Koshe lishmoya. They just somehow can't hear what's actually being said. They're super smart and they just somehow just like always a little bit off. A little bit off. They're just not getting the real, genuine message. Koshe lishmoya. It's hard for them to hear what's actually being said. And then eventually, on the odd occasion where they do get it, maher la'abed. They can't hold on to it. This is not necessarily a statement of intellectual ability. It's a statement of being able to really hear the emes. That's why it's called a chelek ra. If a person can't do that, they have a negative portion. This has nothing to do with intellect anymore. This actually has to do with spirituality. If a person has a chelek ra, that means they've got to work on themselves spiritually to earn the rights to be able to actually know Torah truly, what it's really saying, not what their distorted version is. And that's why one interpretation of chelek ra is that at the time that Adam and Eve ate from the Eitz HaDa'as, das is obviously knowledge. So what happened? It became Eitz HaDa'as toiv v'ra. Prior to that, knowledge was only good. Knowledge was only pristine. It was only possible to know things as Hashem wanted you to know them. Once they ate from the Eitz HaDa'as, the capacity to know things in a way that is ra, that is inappropriate, became part of the human psyche. This person got the chelek ra. Out of the two options of how a person could understand, this person was given the chelek ra, the negative perspective. And so they've got to work on themselves. And this relates directly to the Mishnah we learned in the previous Mishnah, which was what? About people who get angry. Because the Gemara in Pesachim tells us that a person who gets angry loses their wisdom. So why would a person have a chelek ra? Why would a person land up in a space where they just can't really absorb what the Torah is trying to tell them? Must be because they allow themselves to get angry. And as we learned last week, anger is associated with a rejection of Hashem, and anger opens a person up to all kinds of negative energies. So the person's got to work on themselves. You can't change your brain, but you can change your spiritual status, and then Hashem can gift, because remember, the mind is a gift. Hashem can gift a person that they can actually start to see things differently. Let's go back to the example of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva wasn't just simply somebody who was intellectually challenged. Rabbi Akiva had a very negative view of Torah. Before he got involved in learning, He used to say, bring me a Torah scholar and I'll rip him to pieces. His mind wasn't in a healthy place. And yet, look how he was able to change. And so can any of us. So Chelek Ra isn't that a person is stuck in that Chelek Ra. Remember back in the 3rd chapter, we learned Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa told us that Kol she'iras chetoi koidemes lechachmasoi, chachmasoi miskayemes. Any person who has fear of sin, and that precedes their wisdom, then their wisdom will endure. And the corollary is also true, which basically means that if a person is finding that they can't get the wisdom to endure, then the resolution of that is going to have to be yiras chet. The person's going to have to work on their fear of sin, and that's going to help them to get it right. You will notice this Mishnah did not discuss the possibility of the person who forgets everything, or the possibility of the person who remembers everything, because neither one of those is a realistic proposition. So we have to anticipate that we're not going to know everything, we're not going to understand everything, we're not going to retain everything, and that's not expected. But what is expected is to shift ourselves to be more aligned so we can actually absorb what the truth of Torah is telling us, and hopefully we get to the point of Chelek Tov. Hopefully.